This is week 163 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As a side note, yesterday also marked 11 years since Russia invaded Ukraine's eastern Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, collectively known as Donbass. Russia's war against Ukraine that began with the occupation of Crimea in February of 2014 spilled over into eastern Ukraine in April of that year. The war in Donbass saw thousands killed and tens of thousands displaced. Regional capitals of Donetsk and Luhansk remain occupied by Russia to this day. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. On Tuesday, Ukraine announced that it had captured 2 Chinese citizens fighting in the Russian military, with Kyiv alleging soon after that it has evidence of more than 160 Chinese nationals fighting alongside Russia. The Chinese POWs were captured on Ukrainian territory, near the villages of Teresivka and Belokur in Donetsk Oblast. Footage shared by Ukraine's presidential office showed the soldiers energetically describing their experiences, particularly the horror of seeing FPV drones for the first time, with one saying that he'd never even held a weapon before his deployment to Ukraine. Beijing didn't react immediately to the announcement that 2 of its citizens had been captured, cautiously saying that they needed to verify the report with Kyiv first. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, China has posited itself as a neutral party in the conflict, refusing to take a public side. At the same time, it has continued to sell Russia electronic parts and other material without which it wouldn't be able to continue waging war, leading the US State Department to refer to China as enablers of Russia's ongoing invasion. A reported 80% of Russia's imported dual-use goods come from China. As Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas said this week, if China wanted to end the war, it could. Parallels were drawn immediately to the discovery last autumn that North Korean troops were fighting alongside Russia in Kursk Oblast, but it's important to note that the presence of Chinese soldiers on Ukrainian territory doesn't necessarily indicate that Beijing has entered the war on Russia's side. The main question, rather, is whether these soldiers are isolated cases or a reflection of a wide-scale recruitment effort by Russia within China. One of the soldiers captured said that he had entered Russia on the basis of tourism and had paid roughly $3,500 to a broker who helped him enlist in the military, in hopes of rising through the ranks and one day obtaining Russian citizenship. One soldier said that he was born in 1991 and the other in 1998, and as previously mentioned, they did not paint themselves as career soldiers in the way that the captured North Koreans did. Instead, they claim to have received training via hand gestures on the ground in occupied parts of Ukraine's Luhansk Oblast, with one alleging that other Chinese peers in their unit had had trouble with the law at home. I mention this because it tracks with Russia's pattern of recruiting from vulnerable populations, convicts, migrants, for whom fighting in the Russian military seems like a way to transcend otherwise insurmountable circumstances. China has reiterated multiple times since Tuesday that it discourages all of its citizens from participating in any armed conflicts, and has asked Kyiv to temper its rhetoric until more information is made available. The Kremlin also denied that China was directly involved in the conflict, referring somewhat vaguely to the country as a strategic partner, friend, and comrade. The US State Department called the captures and evidence of further Chinese nationals' participation in the war disturbing, which is likely a bit of an understatement for the Trump administration, given both their expressed and tacit anxieties about China. Experts have attributed Trump's cozying up to Putin as an attempt to prevent Moscow and Beijing from getting too close, and his decision on Wednesday to walk back his Liberation Day tariffs on all countries except China, for whom tariffs are currently sitting at 125%, sends a clear message that the US sees China as more of a threat than Russia. We'll see in the coming weeks how Trump and his team react to new developments regarding the presence of Chinese nationals fighting in Putin's army on European soil. In light of Ambassador Bridget Brink ending her 3-year tenure in Ukraine on Thursday over reported disagreements with the Trump administration, we also expect to see some new Americans on the ground here in Kyiv at a particularly unpredictable time. Although the Chinese POWs dominated headlines this week, There were several other significant stories regarding the state of the Frontline. First, on Tuesday, Ukraine confirmed weeks-long rumors that it had entered Russia's Belgorod Oblast, which lies east of Kursk Oblast and borders Ukraine's Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts. There isn't a ton of information on what's happening in Belgorod. Russian military bloggers have reported clashes between Ukrainian and Russian forces there, but it's still unknown how far Ukraine has advanced within the border. As with Ukraine's operation in Kursk Oblast that began last August, we can see multiple ways in which establishing a foothold on a new piece of Russian territory could benefit Ukraine. It creates a potential buffer zone that stops Russia from launching new offensives onto Ukrainian territory, and also gives Ukraine increased leverage in any potential peace negotiations that take place while the territory is held. In short, if Moscow was annoyed with its inability to drive Ukraine out of Kursk after 8 months, it's just had its frustrations compounded. At the same time, the objective rewards of the Kursk operation have been debated. It's cost Ukraine many lives and resources, and hasn't proved a trump card, for lack of better wording, in the negotiations that have taken place so far. Ukraine is highly unlikely to capture as wide a swath of territory in Belgorod Oblast like they did in Kursk Oblast, when there was an element of surprise. An analyst from the Finnish Blackbird Group told the Kyiv Independent that an operation in Belgorod Oblast might be a distraction for Russia, but is unlikely to yield significant territorial or political gains for Ukraine. Another important military development this week was the fact that Ukrainian officials and commanders confirmed that Russia has begun its spring offensive. Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky said on Wednesday that the spring offensive is effectively already underway, with Russian offensive activity almost doubling along the northeastern front line. He referenced comments from President Zelensky made in late March, in which the president warned that Russia was building up troops to launch new offensives against Ukraine's Kharkiv and Sumy oblasts. Russia launched a surprise offensive near Kharkiv last May, which stalled pretty quickly without Russia gaining much territory. There have been no Russian troops in Sumy Oblast since April of 2022, and a potential new offensive there has been a source of anxiety for Ukraine's military and civilians alike. Again, creating a buffer zone to prevent such an event was one of the justifications for the Kursk operation. How these developments will factor into ongoing peace negotiations is anyone's guess, but it's safe to say that things are not slowing down on the battlefield, as talks remain bogged down on the diplomatic stage. If you ask Westerners to name the most famous living Russians, you'll probably get a handful of politicians and some sports figures. One outlier is unquestionably Alexander Ovechkin, left-winger and captain of the Washington Capitals. I cannot overstate how much of a household name Ovechkin is. He's the kind of guy that's known even to those who don't watch hockey, and he's been a dominant force in the sport for decades. This week, he surpassed Canadian Wayne Gretzky's record for the most goals scored in the NHL, netting his 895th last Sunday in a feat that many considered impossible. A Russian being exceptional at hockey isn't inherently critique-worthy in itself. If you can't tell from how I'm phrasing this section, I really like hockey, and shout out to my fellow Blue Jackets fans. The unfortunate theme that emerges with so many Russian expats, however, is a long-standing public relationship with Vladimir Putin and vocal support for the Russian state, and Ovechkin is a particularly stark case of this. Let's start in 2014, when Ovechkin, freshly off a stint as one of the main faces of the notoriously corruption-riddled and LGBTQ-unfriendly Sochi Olympics, participated in a campaign to drum up support for Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea that same year. The campaign's hashtag was Save Children from Fascism, a line taken straight from Kremlin propaganda to justify the genocide of Ukrainians and prop up Russia as the rightful liberator of Ukrainian territory. Let's just take a look at Ovechkin's Instagram profile picture from that time as well. Also in 2014, Ovechkin personally wished Putin happy birthday on social media, writing, "You're on the right track and we respect your actions and will support you in everything because we also love our country." 3 years later, in 2017, Ovechkin started a social movement, reportedly of his own volition, called Putin Team. The Russian news outlet Vedmosti reported that the movement's execution was aided by a PR firm, funded by the Kremlin, but Ovechkin denied that the organization which literally had the Russian president's name in the title, was political. It was also reported around this time that Ovechkin had Putin's personal phone number, and that Putin had even sent him a wedding present when Ovechkin got married in 2016. Even if we give this the most generous read and assume that these incidents are mainly for PR purposes, it implies that Ovechkin's team thought that this was his best way forward as he moved through the ranks of the NHL. To note, in 2017 there were over 30 Russian players in the NHL, and only 3 others aligned themselves with Putin team. Ovechkin has consistently claimed that he's apolitical, that he's ignorant of geopolitics, and that his loyalty to his homeland is just as obligatory as anyone else's. He's never condemned the full-scale invasion as such. And you can see why Putin would hold him in high regard. Putin's a well-known hockey aficionado whose PR stunts betray a deep desire to be seen as a star athlete like Ovechkin. You can also see why it behooves the Kremlin to keep one of the biggest sports stars of all time on its side, never allowing him to abandon Russia, literally or ideologically. Hockey has reportedly been an unlikely point in the recent talks between Donald Trump and Putin, with the two discussing the prospect of arranging games between the NHL and the Russian League, the KHL. Russia has been banned from nearly all major sporting events since the start of the full-scale invasion, with the KHL reduced to 20 Russian teams and 1 team each from Belarus, Kazakhstan, and China. Friendly US-Russia games would signify a break in this widespread boycott, as well as a massive stroke to Putin's ego, much like Ovechkin's record last Sunday. Sports have never existed in a vacuum. Whether it's hockey, gymnastics, or chess, sports provide a stage for ideologies and nations to compete through individuals, with participants well aware that they're performing for an audience and representing a defined ideal. When asking whether Ovechkin deserves global praise, one might keep in mind that Ovechkin's words about the obligatory loyalty one feels toward their homeland bear striking similarity to the justifications offered by soldiers killing Ukrainians on Putin's orders. One might also remember that nearly 500 Ukrainian athletes and coaches have been killed by Russia since 2022 in the full-scale invasion that Ovechkin can't refer to as such. Ovechkin might think that by playing dumb about politics, he's keeping his hands clean. I'd argue that it's the opposite. For our member question this week, I'll be asking my colleague Francis to give me a hand in answering. The question from Robin: given the capture of the Chinese, I suppose I wonder, are the North Koreans still engaged in battle? And if so, are they also pushing with Russia over the Ukrainian border after the close to full retreat from Kursk? So Francis, what do you think?
That's actually a great question, Robin. I wish I could give you a better answer right now. The Kursk Oblast and Sumy Oblast border, which has become this front line that's kind of going back and forth across 2 states, is a gray area for our understanding of the war. Access to there is very restricted, and so the only information that we get in is coming from kind of anecdotal sources and telegram. There is still fighting in Kursk Oblast. There's still that little bit of Russian land that Ukrainians are holding on to. And the North Koreans are reported to be active in that area, trying to push Ukraine out of those last few villages. We haven't heard any verifiable reports that they've crossed the border into Sumy Oblast, but it's going to be a big question, especially if that becomes a new axis of a major spring offensive into Ukraine. Or they could be moved into the Donbass area as well. So it's a little bit early to say now, but in terms of the geopolitical implications for those North Korean soldiers actually assaulting and taking territory inside Ukraine, potentially in the future, it's definitely something that we'll need to look out for. So thank you for that question, Robin.
Thanks, Francis. That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. Your support is what allows us to create shows like Ukraine This Week, and we're so grateful for our community. If you'd like to join us, there's a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated.